'Tis better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all. This line was written by Alfred Tennyson after a very good friend of his died of a brain hemorrhage at the age of 22. It was repeated again by Johnny Paprika after watching Mark Pryor get hit by a comebacker in 2005, which was the beginning of the end of the promise he had shown on the bump for the Cubs. Would players say this about themselves? Was it better to taste success in the show and have it yanked away, rather than to have just majored in computer science and worked in Silicon Valley? I've got another quote for you. There's no such thing as a small god. Once somebody starts playing God, sooner or later things will get out of hand. Today, the Dugs are turning our noses up at that notion. We're going to do a little God cosplaying and enter our final team into the experimental baseball tournament, the Tucson Tusoons. These are players who showed great promise but were taken out of the game before their time. Puny mortals. Welcome back to the Dugs. My name is Johnny Paprika, and everything that we do here is an excuse to tell a lot of baseball stories and a lot of jokes. So if that sounds interesting to you, stay in the know and help us grow by getting a free shiny new subscription. Today we're going over the last of our 8 teams entering this second iteration of our experimental baseball tournaments. And then when we return, we'll be jumping into the tournament simulation and see how the cookie crumbles. As we mentioned up front, we've got a team of guys that we feel could have had much more substantive careers had the cards not played out the way they did. Let's see who we've got. Let's change it up a bit and start behind the plate. Thurman Munson's in the old number 2. He actually did get 11 seasons in, all of them with the Yankees, and was still going strong in the final year of his career, slashing .288, .340, .374. However, during an off day in August that year, he tragically crashed his plane he was trying to learn to land and did not survive. His number was immediately retired and received a plaque in Monument Park the next year. He was a seriously decorated ball player that most likely still had some great years in his future, having taken down both Rookie of the Year and MVP. He also made 7 All-Star teams. At first base, we have Dave Nielsen. Story's a little different from a plane crash here. Dude was a highly touted prospect, finally made the All-Star team in a contract year, which is usually a good sign for the next contract you're going to sign. And then at the age of 29, he said, I kind of feel like going back home to Australia to play baseball. Depending on how much you like money, his reasoning is either going to sound incredibly noble or incredibly stupid to you. You see, he just really wanted to play in the 2000 Olympics while representing his home country, and the only way he was allowed to do that was by not being professionally affiliated with the major leagues. Now, it was kind of a big deal that year as the Olympics were in Sydney, and it was only the 3rd time a baseball tournament was played out as a full medal sport. It was a fairy tale ending as Australia was swiftly eliminated during qualifying after going 2-5, including an actual adult slaughter rule loss to the eventual gold winners, the US of A, who won 12-1 after 7 innings of humiliating baseball. Don't worry though, he came back to once again represent his country in the 2006 World Baseball Classic, where they were eliminated in the group stage after going 0-3. I'm giving him a hard time though. He also represented Australia in the 2004 Olympics, where they went on a Cinderella run and improbably won the silver medal. He also played a huge role in making Australia the superpower they are in international baseball. Nah, I can't. Let's go on to the next guy. At second base, we have Freddie Sanchez. Freddie went the more traditional route of injury after injury after injury. In fact, he bookended his career with injuries. It was looking like he was going to get his first real chance at the show with the Pittsburgh Pirates. When he was traded over there, he started at AAA and played exactly 1 game before injuring his ankle, forcing him into surgery in the offseason. He lost half of the next season to that injury as well, but did make it up in September with lackluster results. So his age 27 year rolls around and he's finally set to start the season with the big league club. He hasn't proven himself as of yet due to limited action, so he's mostly a bench player until June, but eventually he wins the starting spot after the injury bug starts biting others, and he has himself a nice season. Next year he's 28 because that's how time and space works, and he once again starts as a bench player, but by the end of the season he's gone ahead and earned himself the batting title. He has another great year at the age of 29, but falls off a bit at the age of 30. Then, at 31, the injuries start coming in and he never cracks 500 plate appearances in a year again. He did win a World Series, but it's one of those cases of what might have been had he been able to start his career earlier. Nomars, that's short. Nomar's story is going to sound a bit familiar after Freddie's story. He was a Boston legend. In Garcia Parra's first 4 full seasons, he averaged 198 hits, 110 runs scored, 105 RBIs, and won 2 batting titles, hitting .357 and .372 in 1999 and 2000. He was in the MVP conversation every healthy year he had with the Red Sox. Now, the injuries started before he left the team, breaking his wrist in 2001, which limited him to 21 games that year, but he managed to come back from that bump in the road, putting up elite numbers in 2002 and 2003. Then he was traded away to the Cubs, and he never saw 500 plate appearances in a season again. In 4 of his last 6 seasons, he missed at least half of the games. The run at the beginning of his career was so great that the pundits were all wondering what milestones he wouldn't break in his career. In the end, they were left wondering the same thing about his bones and tendons. At third base, it's a little-known player by the name of Jackie Robinson. I mean, we all know Jackie Robinson. His number is retired in every major league ballpark, which means no one wears it anymore unless everyone is wearing it to honor the man. He broke the color barrier in baseball, but what you may not realize is that he didn't break that barrier until his age 28 season. He played until he was 37, so we're talking about the reverse here. What would Jackie have been able to do if his career was only allowed to start? His path to baseball was even weirder than it had to be for the man that would eventually break the color barrier. He lettered in 4 different sports at UCLA, but only played baseball for a year and hit .097 in his only season. He was trying to strike it big in sports, but his initial focus was football as he played for a semi-professional team in Hawaii and had plans to continue to pursue that dream when he came back to the mainland. That never came to fruition, however, as World War II and the draft came a-calling, but he never saw any action. Despite the fact he was good enough to join a tank battalion to defend the country, he wasn't quite good enough to sit at the front of the bus in the military. It was an unsegregated bus line, but the driver didn't quite care. Jackie refused, and the bus driver did give up. That is, until Jackie's back was turned and he tattled on him to the military police. He wasn't directly punished for this incident, but he was transferred to another battalion where they essentially made up a bunch of new charges and court-martialed him. He was eventually acquitted, but 2 years had passed in all this mess, and instead of going overseas and undoubtedly killing Hitler immediately, he was ping-ponged around a bunch of racist, bureaucratic nonsense. So it's 1945 and he finally gets interested in baseball again, but baseball is still segregated. It's recommended that he give the Negro League's Kansas City Monarchs a call, which he does, and he plays a single season and rakes, but he's disappointed with the whole thing. In his opinion, compared to the more structured environment of college athletics, the Negro Leagues at this point is disorganized, leading to a ton of haphazard travel and just a crap load of gambling. He eventually gets noticed by some major league scouts and lands himself a minor league contract, not only to test his baseball acumen, but to test his ability to turn the other cheek when the inevitable racial epithets start coming his way. Finally, in 1947, he's called up to the big leagues, but he's 28 at this point. It doesn't stop him from racking up Rookie of the Year honors, however, and leading the league in stolen bases. He finishes the season with an on-base percentage of .383, which is actually below his career mark of .410. It boggles my mind that he was able to achieve this on the biggest stage there is for baseball. Think about what goes into making the show. Well, Jackie went from preferring football to be dragged into a war that apparently he wasn't even really wanted for, to being disillusioned with his Negro League experience, to only having a single year in the Major League Minors before being called up, and then winning the Rookie of the Year before being perennially in the MVP conversation every year. He's got a batting title, he's got a World Series ring, so he was fantastic and dominant, but it begs the question of, if not for all the nonsense that disallowed him a more traditional path to the bigs, would he have been even better? Would the extra years of his career led to some eye-popping milestones? I wish we could have found out, but at the same time, I think there's this really satisfying sense of I told you so, of wiping it in the face of the doubters that Jackie was able to do all of this in spite of all the nonsense. Okay, who has to follow that? Josh Hamilton's out in left field. Things were going well for Josh as he was the first overall selection in the draft and racked up a minor league championship, and then a dump truck ran into his truck while his parents were in the car. They all walked away from the accident, but Hamilton would miss time with an injury, which gave him a lot of free time, and he had a lot of money he wasn't used to having, as his signing came with a $4 million bonus. The money went to drugs, tattoos, and alcohol, and subsequently rehab, and more rehab. But he sticks with baseball, is shuffled around teams a bit, and finally makes it to the big leagues at the age of 26. As he steps up to the plate, fans are familiar with his story and give him a 22-second standing ovation, while opposing catcher Michael Barrett says, "You deserve it, Josh. Take it all in, brother. I'm happy for you." His first home run would come the next day. He won the MVP in 2010, and he was ridiculous. He hit .359 with a slugging percentage of .633. There were several relapses later in his career, and along with those came the ugly incident of physically assaulting his eldest daughter. So he obviously struggled with some demons, and I don't feel qualified to comment beyond that, but after showing what he's capable of on the diamond, it makes you wonder what a full career of a clear-headed Josh Hamilton would have looked like. In center, it's Curt Flood. Like a horny teenager that's just discovered the internet, his premature ending was self-inflicted. In the Black Sox video, we talked a little bit about baseball's reserve clause already, which essentially gave your rights to the team you sign with for life. It's a big part of the reason why White Sox players were looking for extra money outside of their cheapskate owner Comiskey. It's also why Curt Flood was eventually blackballed from baseball. In 1969, the Cardinals agreed to trade him to the Phillies. Flood was not a fan of this decision. At the time, the Phillies were terrible at baseball and played in a park that was well past its prime in the same way that Rush Limbaugh is currently past his prime. In a debacle that could earn its own video, Connie Mack Stadium, formerly Shibe Park, was still set up as if it were pre-World War II. Human beings had moved on to cars from public transportation, and as such, the 500-car capacity lot didn't really cut it. They expanded parking, but when you're starting at 500 and trying to put a band-aid over that issue, you're going to have a problem. The stadium's ownership was passed from party to party when really they should have just tore the whole thing down. He perceived the Phillies fans as more racist and also wasn't crazy about hearing about the trade secondhand. He would have loved the Twitter age. So he refused to report and convinced the Players Association to support him in a lawsuit. It sounds extreme, all this over a trade, but you have to consider there was no eventual out into free agency. You could be bought and sold or kept for cheaper than you deserved and you'd have no control over it. Well, he lost the case and was subsequently Colin Kaepernicked out of the sport. He received death threats from fans who saw his actions as trying to destroy the game, and no owner or GM would touch him. History, however, holds him in a more positive light. His lawsuit was seen as the first real shot in the war against the reserve clause, which was eventually defeated not long after 1975, ushering in the era of the free agent, giving players a bit more control over their fate. He even has an act named after him. The Curt Flood Act of 1998 removed baseball's antitrust status, which meant that owners didn't have sole control over the players' contracts or careers any longer, allowing 10-year veterans of the league the ability to have a say in their proposed trades. He made one more short cameo in the league, but that lasted all of 13 games and was following a year he had taken off. He was 31 when the lawsuit blew up in his face, and he was well on his way to becoming an elite player before it all fell apart. Lastly, we've got Tony Conigliaro in right field. You see this ear flap? This ear flap's a great idea, and Conigliaro is definitely one of the reasons it came into being. In 1967, he took a fastball to his face, which fractured his cheekbone, dislocated his jaw, and severely damaged his left retina. He miraculously made a comeback a year and a half later, and the season after that, he even reached a career high in home runs. However, his vision would continue to deteriorate as a result of his injury, and his last meaningful game came at the age of 26. Well, this has been an absolute bummer. When coming up with the theme for this team, I didn't consider having to rattle off tragedy after tragedy and expect our viewers to stomach it and still enjoy the video. So let's take a breath here and watch one of my favorite videos of all time. Every time I see it, a little ray of sunshine hits me right in the tummy. Okay, let's muscle through. Coming off the bench, we've got Mo Vaughn, David Wright, Ralph Kiner, and Juan Encarnacion, who all went the injury route. We also have Lyman Bostock, who was straight up shot in the head. The man who shot him was tried twice for murder. The first time, the jury was hung. The second time, he was found not guilty by reason of insanity, and rather than serve prison time, he was confined to a psychiatric hospital. Apparently, it's one of the best psych hospitals of all time, as 7 months later, he was deemed no longer insane and then released. To Indiana's credit, they thought, hey, there's maybe a flaw in our judicial system, and soon changed the law to allow a technically insane person to be found guilty, meaning that they would still have to serve prison time after their psychiatric treatment. Let's turn to the starting rotation. Smokey Joe Wood was an early 20th century pitcher that seems to be the consensus hardest thrower of the era. It appears that he achieved this with some pretty crappy mechanics, however, as it is well known that his appearances put a great strain on him. This was further complicated when he slipped on the grass and broke his thumb, forcing him to pitch in pain for the next 3 years. The result was a slower recovery time, and so he went from starting over 30 games in a season to only starting a number in the teens for the remainder of his career. He pulled a Rick Ankiel, who's also on this team as we explore his ability to reclaim his pitching ability, and Smokey Joe pivoted to being a position player to extend his career. It was more or less a successful move, slashing .283, .357, .411, but he stepped away after the 1922 season due to family obligations. We're going to use him as a pitcher for the Two-Soons and let him pitch as if he were in his heyday, before he tore his arm to pieces and during the era where he racked up 34 wins in a season. Sandy Koufax is up next. One of the reasons he's so noteworthy was that he was only 36 when he was elected to the Hall of Fame, the youngest ever. Of course, this also means that his career was over sooner than most, as he called it after his age 30 season due to an arthritic elbow. However, in the time that he did have with the league, he proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that he was one of the best ever. He racked up 3 Cy Young awards, including the rare double honor of winning the Cy Young and MVP in the same season. He went out in a lot of pain, but also at the top of his game. He led the league in ERA in each of his final 5 seasons, including his career best mark of 173 in his final season. We're going to screw his arm back on and see what he's going to do for Tucson. Next up, we have Mark Fidrich. Unfortunately, sports medicine in the 1970s isn't what it is today, as apparently no one knew what a torn rotator cuff was. Everyone thought that Mark just had a bad mix of bile colors and phlegm, so they attached some leeches to him and cracked him upside the head with a mallet a few times. This, shockingly, did not solve the problem for Mark, and he attempted to continue throwing with the bum rotator cuff, which didn't last long as he had to retire at the age of 25. The potential was readily apparent. He led the league in ERA in his rookie year and followed that up with a .289 in his sophomore season. It was during that second season, however, that he blew out his shoulder in July, which served as the beginning of the end. We already highlighted Thurman Munson and his fatal plane crash. It would be another 23 years before a baseball player would die during the season. That player was Derailed. He failed to show up for pregame warm-ups, and so hotel staff went to go check on him, where they discovered his lifeless body still in bed. It was heart disease that got him, as he had a 90% blockage in 2 arteries. He was 33 at the time of his death, but still going strong, as he was sitting on a .372 ERA in that year. He was a 3-time All-Star and had multiple appearances in the top 5 of Cy Young votes. Bringing up the rear in the rotation, it's J.R. Richard. It's another scary one, as he collapsed while playing catch before a game. It turned out to be a stroke caused by a blood clot in his neck. He survived it and even attempted a comeback, but the stroke had slowed his reaction time to the point where he was no longer viable at the major league level. And so his last major league season came at the age of 30. While he was active, he had some notable highlights. He struck out 313 hitters in 1979, which is a record for the Astros, until Garrett Cole broke it much later in 2019. He also led the league in ERA that year, which was the year before he suffered the stroke, so obviously he still had gas in the tank. Out of the pen, we have several other injury-laden or blown-out arms like Kerry Wood, Mark Pryor, Mark Mulder, Chris Carpenter, and Dave Dravecki. We also have another tragic death that happened not too long ago in Jose Fernandez. But it's the experimental baseball tournament, so we've resurrected and reinflated all these pitchers' arms to give them one last chance at glory. And that wraps up our teams. We're going to take a little time off to wrap up the simulations, and we'll see you back in a few weeks to bring you the tourney. Now that you know who all of the 8 teams are, or if you don't, make sure to check out our Season 2 playlist to catch up. We would love to hear your predictions in the comments. Once again, if you're enjoying these videos, the most helpful thing you can do for us is to like these videos and subscribe to our channel, as that's the most surefire way for the Dugs to become a thing. And the only thing left to say is that, as always, I've been Johnny Paprika, hoping all your balls are fair and all of your wood is good. Good night, everybody!